Howard Pyle wrote in 1897, quote, "The true artist paints that which he sees in the world of nature, and not that which other men in studios tell him he ought to see." So in this video, what I wanted to do was present a history of American illustration, beginning with an introduction to the Golden Age. Now, this is based on a course I developed years back for illustration students at a state school or state college. And the reason was, on my behalf, was to provoke critical engagement with the history, the social and the material history of illustration from the Golden Age forward. And actually the course began with the Civil War. So let's begin. Let's get into it. And let's talk about what it was that set up the most famous illustration artists in the Golden Age. What was it that drove and allowed them to have that kind of peak of technique and narrative illustration? So it's not just because it's due to the proliferation of magazines. Magazines were the first truly mass medium in the U.S. And though they did not become large-scale operations until the 1890s or thereabouts, which was a century and a half into their existence, the magazine business grew rapidly between the close of the Civil War and Progressive Era. So rapid industrialization following the Civil War produced way more American products. And by the turn of the century, America was well on its way to a developed consumerism. In turn, periodicals or magazines became one of the perfect forums for advertisers to reach a large audience. In 1865, there were nearly 700 titles, magazines, with a total circulation of about 4 million. 40 years later, in 1905, there were some 6,000 magazines with a total audience of 64 million. An average of 4 magazines per household is what that would turn out to be. So these expansions corresponded to the growth of all American industries during the same period. During the 1890s, America was optimistic, was prosperous, salaries were higher than ever, and the cost of living was relatively inexpensive. Education was also made available to all classes, and following the Civil War, public libraries expanded substantially, providing ready access to all kinds of reading material, not just magazines. All in all, reader consumerism was a direct result of the Industrial Revolution. So even in a setup like this, what I'm trying to do is not focus on artist bio, not focus on technique, not focus on, how something was made, but rather why it was made and what were the conditions in which it flourished. It's not to say how something is made is bad. It just means it's one of 3 things. And so you always need to be hitting on those 3 things to have a fully developed understanding and appreciation of, I think, a genre, an artist, whatever it is. So the condition responsible for what I was setting us up with was a general economic stability and prosperity, which resulted in a new affluent middle class. Literacy was more universal in middle-income families. Leisure time increased due to shorter working hours, some labor-saving inventions. Also, improvements in printing technologies, of course, allowed for a wider distribution. One key element for drawn magazines was the popularity of short story or novella, which was the result of the above. Both could be read in a single sitting, and the advent of periodicals. Further, short stories gave the reader an incentive to buy the next issue because there may be some kind of cliffhanger or resolution in the next periodical. And so because of this, illustrators were in high demand. To create an illustrated periodical was highly precarious due to high overhead, costs associated with production. So the only way to be profitable doing this was the inclusion of advertising. So in 1868, Peterson's magazine used 25 ads in its Christmas issue. Advertisements were generally grouped into a section at the front or at the back of a periodical, And illustrators could be paid by the publishers or by advertising agencies. Most all ad agencies would pay better. The Journal, the Post, and other titles like Cosmopolitan, McClure's, they existed in a symbiotic relationship with other aspects of mass culture. So when increasing conglomerate corporations needed to launch major advertising campaigns to create demand for mass-produced goods, they found that magazines were the best way to reach that audience. It was this financial base of national advertising that enabled magazine publishers to lower cover prices from 10 to 15 cents, pulling in huge numbers of readers from the swelling U.S. population, thus creating the broad consumer base that corporate interests needed. Magazine publishers, in effect, had two businesses. They were selling readers to advertisers and selling magazines to readers. But before either transaction could be made, the magazine first had to get the attention of the consumer. The key to this accomplishment was the cover. This declared the magazine's personality, the promise of what the reader would expect. And so it follows that the key to the above requires the assistance and the expertise of the illustrator. Yet, this also gave rise to the dilemma regarding the nature and the status of the illustrator, the illustrator's artwork, when faced with having to compromise principles for advertising. So now we're thinking about issues of artistic integrity, perhaps. Specifically, and one of the reasons for this, advertising before 1900 had been a shaky and unstable enterprise. There were unscrupulous claims on behalf of patent medicines that had tarnished the credibility of advertisers in general. So this marginality of advertising was reflected in poor design and imagery. And early advertisers rarely commissioned drawings or paintings and instead tended to use crude lithographs by anonymous figures or artists. And this was mainly due to limited printing technologies. But with the emergence of popular magazines before the end of the century, individual companies and ad agencies began to make concerted efforts to boost their standings and establish themselves as honest professionals. In essence, quality illustration was an indicator of refinement, the good taste of the advertiser, the product, and even the purchasing public. However, while some illustrators embraced advertising, others viewed it with suspicion still. So, regardless of the objection, some illustrators' consistent condition persisted. Namely, throughout all of art history, all artists have been used to display the wealth and power of their patrons. In the 19th century, the publishing industry emerged as the chief employer of artists. So that would be one way that you could see this condition as one of consistent, right? It was consistent throughout all of art history that artists would work for a patron. In this case, it's ad agencies. However, there's a tension here. And this initial tension would be of the illustrator searching for the romantic idea of pure art experience. Illustrators were trained in regular art education, fine art educations. They weren't trained as illustrators. So there is in many illustrators a drive to have that pure art experience. And then in tension with that is the need to sell, the need to make a living. I would argue that this is still the case, for many artists. So this is the central and ongoing debate, foundational to understanding, a lot of the illustrators during early years of the golden age and even into the present, like I said. So in addition to that, the illustrator was forever caught between what the audience wanted to see, the art director would allow for, and the fulfillment of his or her own artistic endeavors. Illustrators that became successful during this period that also transitioned to fine art, if you wanted to kind of broaden this a little bit, might be Arthur Dove. You could think of Edward Hopper, Everett Shinn, George Lukes, and all felt that illustration was an inferior vocation to fine art painting, yet none of them compromised their standards in their illustrations. However, and this is an interesting point, the American public did not like fine art on its magazine covers, or what we might consider fine art at that time. So, as an example, Ladies' Home Journal once paid everybody's favorite, John Singer Sargent, $1,000 to feature his portrait of Ethel Barrymore on its cover, and it did not sell well. For those illustrators willing to work in advertising, the average illustrator at that time made $4,000 a year, which was enough to afford a nice house, enough to afford help. And a top illustrator could make anywhere from $10,000 to $75,000 a year, which would essentially make them wealthy. Illustrators enjoyed the status of celebrity, kind of in the golden age and years before. They would be advertised by the magazine to increase sales and interest. And so this period was deservingly called the golden age for those reasons. Most illustrators, if we get into the making of a work, kept clipping files or reference, as most all had images and needed to invent. A large majority of American illustrators were trained in European style and had drawn extensively from living figures. In contrast, the American model of training required that students draw from casts and kind of painstaking effort to learn proportions. The process of creating an illustration would involve an art editor who would receive a schedule of stories, maybe 3 to 4 months in advance. And then the art editor would select the illustrator he thought best for each item. So short story, serial ad, review, etc. And the goal of the illustrator, in the case of a story, was to interpret the text, but never give the story away. In most every case, a great deal of research was required, from costumes to maybe hiring seamstresses, understanding unfamiliar landscapes or geographical areas. And when illustrators sold drawings to publishers before 1900s, they sold the reproduction rights and the drawings. So many of these drawings would be destroyed or have been destroyed to make room in these publishing companies or illustration areas to file more, to keep more originals that were more relevant. And it's this practice, this destruction of originals, that makes finding original drawings prior to 1900 really difficult. Practices like the above also were why we have the Society of Illustrators, which was founded in 1901. These changes in technologies led to, as I said earlier, great deal of expansion. The century's end brought Spanish-American War, and that received wide pictorial coverage by illustrators. Artists, especially like Clackens, Gruger, Shin, John Sloan, drew incessantly recording events and later fell under the influence of Robert Hunry's teaching, which became known as the Ashcan School. So, though photography was becoming more regular in turn-of-the-century newspaper, the majority of magazines continued to use illustration on their covers because they were dealing with selling ideals rather than reality. And this would be a radical place to look if you are interested in a moment of rupture or split between fine art history and practices and illustration. Fine art went a totally different direction. They started to investigate the conditions of their own making, the materials. It's a material interrogation as the fine arts go forward into simpler and more deductive means of understanding the components of a picture. Illustration went a different direction into selling ideals. So, what is an ideal? Or for example, a woman's face or portrait could represent both a specific type of female beauty and a style that conveyed model attributes, right? So why would we want something like that? Well, an ideal sells something that is impossible to attain. And if there's a gap between what is pictured, then we have a very fortuitous area in which we can sell a product that might give somebody the idea that they could achieve that standard or ideal. So illustrators who created early or the earliest cover ideals developed distinct styles that could help form individual magazines' identities in addition to their own. Most often, that identity appeared through a certain signature, specifically type of woman's portrait or woman's face. And this would often be identified by the artist's name. So think of like the Gibson girl, the John Held girl, John Held Jr. The various permutation of an idealized type became the first mass media stereotype. It's what these are. And according to Teresa Perkins, who's a great person to look at for this, a stereotype is a result of three factors. One, it's got to be simple, simplicity. Two, it needs to be immediately recognizable. And three, there has to be an implicit reference to an assumed consensus about complex social relationships. So simple, immediately recognizable, and distills or references some kind of assumed consensus about complex ideas in society. In 1987, and now this gets us to the point where, with that as a setup, I'd like to focus on two main figures that I find to be fascinating or at least foundational to an understanding of the golden age going forward. One, Alice Barber Stephens, who did 6 covers for Ladies' Home Journal titled The American Woman, right? So what I intend to show is one illustrator who strayed from that kind of idea of the illustrator needing to create an ideal, another who I think did less so. Alice Barber Stephens attempted to depict the American woman, quote unquote, as she is. These issues would meet a massive audience for the first time with some 850,000 readers. And in essence, these were the very first images providing visual commentary on gender. So I think Alice Barber Stephens is one really interesting illustrator for one, not leaning into that ideal, that stereotype. And in addition to that, actually giving a critical or a commentary on gender and gender relationships. So the themes of her images depict the woman inside and outside the home in both social and commercial settings. And they give a description or a narrative of her role within each. At core, these images depict a gradual change in the role of women, which reflect both changing notions of gender and the economic aspirations of a developing middle class. While Ladies' Home Journal reached an extremely broad and relatively diverse audience, its primary reader was white, native-born, middle-class woman who lived in or with the uncertain legacies of the 19th century women's rights movement. Alice Barber Stephens was born during the Civil War into a farm family of 9 children. Her sensibilities were primarily shaped by the Victorian era, conservative Philadelphia society to which she was born and had raised. She was the very first woman to be admitted to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where she was trained under Thomas Eakins. Stephens was married, mother of 4, and would regularly illustrate for the top publications of the time. In this sense, she was a living example of a new woman who combined family and career. So, magazines typically contained Bible sermons, fairy tales, advice columns on products such as candy consumption, soap. But all in all, the magazine emphasized a type of practical utility or usefulness to women in a domestic setting or sphere. The women painted by Stephens eventually gave way to the girls painted by Gibson, Fisher, etc. And that's what I mentioned earlier. The height of a successful illustrator might be your name being identified with a woman's portrait. But I think here there's a radical separation. Alice Barber Stephens is commenting and depicting women, And what happens when we move into the male illustrators more geared toward developing that style is there's, attention put on girls, right? Younger women. So Stephens' idea of the American girl in summer showed the woman outside freed from the domestic sphere. This was troubling to many, surprisingly. So, for example, Edward Bach commented that open air tempted young women to abandon propriety for more primitive pleasures. Completely nutty, right? But if we go back and look at the magazine itself, the magazine as this vehicle through which illustrators are able to show their work, there's a paradox in the sense that the Ladies' Home Journal is advocating through the work of Alice Barber Stephens for the freedom and upward mobility of women. Yet, this very idea of freedom threatens definitions of domesticity at the core of the journal's message. I think these types of paradoxes are riddled throughout the history of American illustration and in illustration practices more largely. Another artist that we could focus on as an introductory figure or a foundation figure to American illustration. What I'm proposing here is there's two pillars, perhaps, Alice Barber Stephens and Howard Pyle. I think Howard Pyle much more so celebrated and known. I find, students mostly just Howard Pyle, I really like his values. Okay, well, he did some other things too, and that's what we're going to add. He's largely considered the father of American illustration, and his influences stem from two sources. He was a superb illustrator, but he was also an educator. Pyle's first illustration was Christmas Morning in New York in 1880 for Harper's Weekly. Pyle is responsible for tens of thousands of mental images or archetypes that we share, like the archetype of the pioneer, the homesteader, or the pirate, or the revolutionary soldier. From our own archetypal images, or his own archetypal images, we've come to have an influence on TV, movies, theater. So in this sense, Pyle founded a practice that was distinctly American and separate from a European tradition. He would mostly become known for his illustrations in Harper's magazine and his illustrated children's books. He told the story of Robin Hood in an illustrated novel and reached the world of or revealed the world of pirate lore to his readers in illustrated short series or stories. But in the 1890s, he decided that he wanted to teach what he had learned through his experience as an illustrator. At that time, there were no courses in any schools for studying illustration, so he offered his services to the Drexel Institute, and that's in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And in 1896, he began teaching there. And that year, he had 5 students of extraordinary talent, 3 women, 2 men. They included Violet Oakley, Elizabeth Shippen Green, Jessie Wilcox Smith, Maxfield Parrix, and Frank Schoonover, all massive names in illustration. Pyle's classes grew from year to year as his reputation as a teacher spread. He created a special summer course only for his most promising students, and that was held in an old mill along the Brandywine River in the village of Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. And in 1900, he opened his own tuition-free school in Wilmington, Delaware. The training he provided produced a crop of confident, supremely skilled young artists whom Pyle personally shepherded into their first professional roles. As an example of what a class under Pyle might have entailed, in 1903, the students who studied at his school in Wilmington, Delaware, gathered for their weekly drawing class where they worked on whatever quick assignment Pyle might introduce. At Pyle's suggestion, 3 of the students invited the local textile mill owner, whose name was Samuel Bancroft Jr., to join them for the first of 3 classes held at their studio. And on the evening of March 25th, 1903, the members of Pyle's class sketched their interpretations of Pyle's topic, The End. So the narrative realism that Pyle and his students' practice became the primary approach to illustration of the early 20th century and would become to be known as the Brandywine tradition. The Brandywine classes began in the summer of 1898. Many of these courses were held outdoor, and Pyle was paid no salary or took no payment. The students were handpicked by Pyle to participate, and Pyle soon left Drexel after and constructed his own school at his Wilmington property, where students would pay. Each student would pay $4.90 per month, which is a far cry from the price of art schools today. And later, Pyle would expand his education by allowing for working illustrators to enroll who were in need of professional development. So, although Pyle's practice is distinctly American, it is possible to draw connections with some French realists, right? So trying to find opportunities to bridge to a more traditional art history canon, or maybe more known art historical figures. So connection could be made perhaps between artists such as Francois Millet, Edouard Manet, Gustave Courbet, or Daumier, anybody whose name ends with an A. Realism rejected academic norms, right? So that dictated the portrayal of idealized figures and idealized situations. So remember, the realism and idealism are antithetical to one another normally. Howard Pyle wrote in 1897, quote, "The true artist paints that which he sees in the world of nature, and not that which other men in studios tell him he ought to see." Further, there are a few of us who hold that art, according to our understanding, is not an abstract and general effort to embellish a canvas with more or less beautiful forms and colors applied with technical dexterity, but that art is, or should be, the effort to represent nature as we know it. So I always read that quote to students who are obsessed with the idea of copying as the pinnacle of artistic achievement, right? Especially for those in the illustration genre. Instead, even from the very beginning, the father of American illustration is sharing that it's the way that we know nature, not the way that we only observe it. And that technical dexterity is not the pinnacle of achievement. Lastly, Pyle states, to our mind, the artist is measured by the depth of his own impressions and by his ability to make other men comprehend their impressions. So I think early in his writings, the writings of Pyle, what you see is a lean or an emphasis on messaging, content, right, at the expense of form, technique, right, which is a big part of what I want these to be able to convey. So let's return to Pyle and his students. Pyle and his students practiced an illustration that was intended to be true to life and would create meaningful communication. Essential to this type of narrative illustration was a few things that they would focus on: poses and body language, which would suit a written description for a character, facial character and expression, physical and emotional interaction between characters, depiction of believable relationships between a character and their environment, specific lighting, composition designed to lead the viewer to understand the narrative expressed within each picture through an intentional hierarchy of attention-getting and sequential clues, and generally limited color palettes with intense colors used to accent or accentuate intended centers of interest. Pyle always strove to create deliberate, tonal compositions. So here's my tip of the hat to all of you that love studying some Pyle for value. His tonal compositions would direct the viewer's attention through a deliberate series of investigations in the image. It is masterful, no doubt. However, the process could prove complicated when the engravers had to translate this tonal patterning as a series of corresponding densities of line. So with composition, what Pyle learned early on, illustrating for publication, was that the work must accommodate rather than resist reproduction technologies used for mass replication. So, in other words, Howard Pyle's value organization isn't masterful because he's Howard Pyle. It's because Howard Pyle was limiting what he was capable of doing and producing to meet the technology of the day. So technology, right? The practice of illustration, the reproduction technology shaped what Pyle did. So he learned that his line work needed to be crisp and secure to avoid imperfections or unintended groupings of lines or values. In solving this early issue, Pyle visited the engraving company. He studied the woodcuts of Albrecht Dürer, Renaissance artist, and to make his foolproof to the inconsistencies of the reproduction processes, or make his practice foolproof, Pyle made an effort to separate his values by clear degrees, rely on simple compositions consisting of 3 to 4 values or areas, or masses, however you'd like to use that terminology. He also avoided complex illustrations in favor of simple pictorial content. So, in essence, Pyle developed compositional practices which emphasized pictures, which used major masses of value, the primary center or center of interest, which created maximum value contrast generally, primary and secondary centers of interest, maybe indicated by a figure or an object that stood out from a value mass or an intense color, or a color different in hue from those around it. And that would bring attention or focus attention on an area of interest. Through these techniques, value and color, Pyle could direct the viewer to look toward or away from specific areas in the composition. In other words, he was able to command a visual sequence of understanding, allowing the viewer to receive a complete message. And at the core of Pyle's teaching was this complete immersion or complete empathizing of the artist with his subject. I think Howard Pyle also serves an example of an illustrator that never needed to turn to advertising. Instead, he was fortunate in always being able to choose the kinds of assignments he wanted. In 1906, though, feeling unsatisfied with the repetitiveness of his recent work and feeling pressure of expenses, a wife, 6 children, 7-member household staff, and a pretty lavish lifestyle, Howard Pyle did take on an art director job for McClure's. He lasted about 5 months. Pyle found he wasn't suited to such a demanding administrative position and then resigned. But with his cash reserves low, Pyle resumed illustration work, but he set his sights on mural painting. This was a far less lucrative venture, but in Pyle's mind, unquestionably a fine art. So the father of American illustration worked entire career, taught, labored on illustrations, but always had that inkling, right? Unquestionably a fine art career, the drive to still satisfy some kind of pure ideal of romantic expression. So Pyle would spend the last 5 years mural painting, which he considered a civic enterprise as well, to surmount artistic constraints he felt his career had placed on him. So ultimately for Pyle, the quest for artistic identity could never be divorced from the practice of illustration or the support of the print media. So Pyle in his own work imagined the termination of life or illustrating the passage of a lifetime. In the image here, he pictures an artist, perhaps himself, painting the ruins of Fort Ticonderoga in the open air. Standing behind the artist is the spirit of Ethan Allen, bearing witness to the past of the fort while watching over the artist recreating that life. So in this image, I think we see a clear concern on the part of Pyle for how the past influences and bleeds into the present. Now, let me give you the other side of that. If Pyle had made some kind of peace with his role as an illustrator, despite some longing for a fine art practice. The other side of that psychology, excuse me, might be someone like N.C. Wyeth. Unlike his teacher, Wyeth was never able to come to terms with his work as an illustrator. Steeped in beliefs of the artist as an independent visionary, Wyeth was tormented by doubts about the value of illustration and remained tormented by his relationship to commerce. So for Wyeth, illustration was inseparable from artistic compromise. Wyeth believed that the principal function of the illustrator was to attract attention and, in short, form of advertising. So for Wyeth, the problem was that illustration merely repeated the incidents of text and was a deterrent from allowing the artist to submit his own emotions and his own interpretations. Wyeth was never able to leave a life as an illustrator, and he would forever struggle with these incompatible ideals of what it meant for him to practice fine art and what he had to sacrifice to be a commercial illustrator. The early success of magazines, right? Wood gravings in the 19th century would continue into the 20th century. However, with better printing technology, better distribution. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper would become Leslie's Weekly. Harper's and Scribner's branched out with special interest children's and women's magazines. McClure's and The Century were other general interest monthly magazines. Cyrus H.K. Curtis, a newspaper publisher, bought the floundering, at this time, the Saturday Evening Post, updated its look, and aimed it at middle-class American families. It would soon become the country's most popular magazine. Curtis also separated the Sunday Women's Supplement from his newspaper, created a new publication for women called the Ladies' Home Journal. And this led to other publishers striving to appeal to a female audience with magazines such as Cosmopolitan, which was published by William Randolph Hearst, Good Housekeeping, Vogue. And each one of these magazines leaned into a different subculture. So, for example, Good Housekeeping leaned into the conservative, well-contented woman, or Vogue would focus on the extremes of women's fashions. Vanity Fair might appeal to that subculture that associated themselves with wit and sophistication. Hence, the ground is now laid for what would become the Golden Age. So in this talk, I hope you found it interesting. I've tried to sow the seeds of illustration as a practice, but one that is forever intertwined with commerce, advertising, and the material realities of the illustrator's life as one caught between having aspirations for fine art and having aspirations for commercial success. This will be, hopefully a good foundation to now move into Golden Age and look at what some artists during that period were doing, whether it was kind of leaning towards the commentary, fine arty work of Alice Barber Stephens, or more toward the idealized type of illustration and the narrative structure that was supported and established by Howard Pyle.